so much for that introduction. I don't know if this thing is on, but can you all hear me?
Press the button.
No. Pressing a button. There you go. Technology. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today. I particularly want to thank AEI, FPI, the Heritage Foundation for hosting today's event. And then you've got fabulous panelists here with Jamie Fly, Danielle Pletka, Jim Carafano, and I apologize, but Tom Donnelly, who wasn't on my list, but it's great to see you too, Tom. And I also am pleased that you're going to have an opportunity to be heard to hear from Senator Graham, as well as Chairman McKeon, and of course Randy Forbes, who chairs the Readiness Subcommittee on the House side, and I'm the ranking Republican on the Readiness Subcommittee for the Senate Armed Services Committee on the Senate side. We're all here today. I think the title of this event is quite appropriate, Defending Defense, which the sequestration shadow on the U.S. military and defense industrial base, because where we are right now certainly does cast a shadow over our national security. And in my view, this is, I think, one of the greatest threats to our national security that Congress created, that we have a duty to address, because the consequences of undermining our national security and creating a a national security crisis on top of our fiscal crisis would really be a very detrimental thing for our nation. And I'm someone who thought that the Budget Control Act was not the right way to go from the beginning. I voted against it. And one of the reasons I voted against it is because I think the lesson we can take from the Budget Control Act is this. When we kick the can down the road around here, when we don't take on the fundamental issues driving our debt, when we don't take on the issues like entitlement reform, tax reform, the things that need to be done, it doesn't get any better. It only gets worse. And this is where we are right now as a result of the super committee failing to come up with the requisite spending reductions, the $1.2 trillion. We are here, and I want everyone, I know all of you follow this closely, but please understand, those of us that want to address these across-the-board cuts, we're not against cutting defense spending if we do it in a responsible way that doesn't undermine our national security. But where we are today is the Department of Defense is already taking a reduction of $487 billion over the next 10 years. That's roughly going to happen under the Budget Control Act, even if the across-the-board cuts coming in January don't happen. And there's a lot of tough choices just in those initial $487 billion in reductions, including a 72,000 reduction in the end strength of our Army, including a 20,000 reduction in the end strength of our Marine Corps, including many choices on deferment on things, particularly our naval fleet, which is going to remain at 285, deferment on issues like attack submarines and making sure that we have put ourselves in a strong position. So there's a lot of tough choices there. Coming on top of it, of course, is the additional $500 billion, which is the MEAT Act's approach. And you all have heard what the impact of that is. You don't have to hear it from the senator from New Hampshire. You can hear it from our Secretary of Defense, who has said that we'd be shooting ourselves in the head. Our Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps has said something that I find truly shocking. It keeps me up at night, and that is that our Marine Corps would be unable to respond to one single major contingency. Can you imagine? Because it means an additional cut of another 18,000 from our Marines. Our Army, it means an additional cut. What we've heard from General Odierno is that it means another 100,000 cut to our Army, 50% coming from the Guard and Reserve. And then for our Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations has said that our fleet goes from 285 to 230 to 235. And of course, our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said that we are going to be increased potential for conflict around the world. And we all know that the risks to our country have not diminished. We have a situation where Iran is doing what it can to acquire the capability of having a nuclear weapon. We see what's happening in Syria. We know that China is investing substantially in its Navy so that they can be dominant in the Asia-Pacific. We also know that it's a very challenging time in dealing with many other issues, North Korea, other areas of the world, and particularly the Middle East still remains a real hotbed of activity. And so the threats to our nation have not diminished, and all of our national security leaders agree on that point. And here we are, putting our Department of Defense in a situation where, as our Secretary of Defense has said, we'd be shooting ourselves in the head. Some of the people who have said we shouldn't address this, I want to take on a couple of their arguments. First, I want to start with the argument that we already spend too much on defense. Defense spending is out of control, and that we are spending a disproportionate amount of our taxpayer dollars on defense spending. So let me just start with a couple of facts. Here's where we are in terms of defense spending. And I don't know if all of you will be able to see this, but this chart represents what percentage of our GDP we spend on defense spending. And if you look at where we are right now, we're spending about 4.7% of our economy or our GDP on defense spending. And that is actually at the low end of our historical spending on military spending. In fact, the United States has averaged 7% between 1946 and 2000. And you can see in here where various conflicts, of course, from World War II to Korea to Vietnam. And we all see the Reagan buildup. And what happened on September 11th in terms of where we are as a country. So those who would say that we are spending a disproportionate amount of our federal dollars and of our economy on defense spending haven't looked at the numbers. The other issue that we need to look at is where are we spending our dollars? It gets back to the fundamental issue of what is it that we have to address to make sure that we put our country on a responsible fiscal path. Does defense spending get us there? No question we should find savings wherever we can in responsible ways. If you look at where we are in terms, you can put that way. What are we spending our money on? So if you go back to 1963, it's gone into reverse. So mandatory spending of entitlements, we were spending about 26% of our federal dollars, outlays at that point, on entitlements, mandatory programs, Social Security, Medicare, and 48% on defense. And now we're spending roughly 60% on those mandatory programs, and we're spending 19% on defense. And so if we don't address this, what we do is we make foolish decisions to undermine the safety of America by only dealing with the 19%, by cutting the 19% very disproportionately. The other thing I'd like to point out that's important is that defense is taking a disproportionate cut, even under the Budget Control Act. If you look at total spending, here we are in this position, total spending, 19% of it is defense, 81% is other spending. You saw 60% of it is entitlements. The remainder is non-defense discretionary spending. Yet 50% of the cuts we did under the Budget Control Act are coming from defense spending. And so to those that would say that somehow we should cut this money from defense, I say you're foolish. There's no question we can do things differently in the Pentagon, and I'm all for reforming the Pentagon to do things better, like acquisitions. We can point to weapon systems where we've made foolish decisions and where we could have saved taxpayer dollars. We should do that. But we should not put ourselves in a position right now where we undermine the safety of this country. And that's where we are. All of our defense leaders, our national security leaders that are serving right now, and many who have served before them have spoken out over this issue. And I had the chance to do a forum where it wasn't AEI, FPI, and Heritage. I actually had Heritage and Brookings on the same panel. And how often do they agree on things? Well, on this issue, in terms of the need for Congress to act on this issue of making sure that we don't allow our defense to be cut in a draconian manner in January, they were uniform in terms of the safety of our country. And so this is an issue that needs to be addressed right away. Not only the national security context, but we already see the impact on our defense industrial base. The estimate is, of course, that on the defense industrial base that we will lose approximately 1 million jobs in 2013, based on a study done by the George Mason University. And I don't think that our defense program is a jobs program. Let's be clear. But the reality is, for our men and women in uniform to have the very best technology that they need, the very best equipment that they need to fight the enemy, to keep themselves safe, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, so that we know when the enemy's coming and we can prevent attacks on this country. We can go on and on. If we do not have a robust defense industrial base, we cannot protect our country. And we are putting that industrial base at risk right now. And it's not just the large employers which are going to be hit by this, like a Lockheed Martin, but it's many small employers. And one of the issues that we're going to face is that there are many sole suppliers and small businesses that make just one component that goes into a weapon system that's very important in terms of the protection of our country, or in shipbuilding. And we've already had leaders in our defense industrial base point this out to Congress. In fact, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Huntington Ingalls Industries, Mr. Mike Peters, wrote that it takes 3 years to manufacture a surface combatant vessel, 4 years to deliver a large deck amphibious ship, and 8 to build an aircraft carrier. And right now, where they are, is that many of their suppliers, in fact, 60% of his company's total material spending is with sole suppliers who design, integrate, and manufacture key systems. And these sole suppliers cannot carry what's coming in January. They can't plan right now where we are. And when they go out of business, they don't just come back, and we lose capacity for our nation. So make no mistake, this is not only putting our national security at risk, but it's also going to impact our defense industrial base in a way that harms jobs, but also harms our capacity to make sure that our men and women have the very best when we send them to protect our country. And finally, there's a basic responsibility that we have, and that is not to break faith with our troops, given the tremendous sacrifices that they've made. And our head of the Marine Corps has said we'll be breaking faith with our troops if we allow sequestration to go forward. The Chief of the Army, General Odierno, has said the same thing. And, you know, I think about last night, I had the privilege of being with our Marine Corps at their parades that they have frequently during the summer in Washington, and spending some time with some of the families of their wounded warriors, Marines who had lost both legs, one arm, and they still feel as patriotic and would go and serve again. And think about it, the sacrifices that have been made. And we owe it to our troops not to break faith and to get this right in Congress. So it is my hope that we will come to the table now to resolve this, because if we wait till January, 2 things happen. I think it's irresponsible to use this issue when it comes to our national security as a bargaining chip or as some kind of political quid pro quo, whether it's tax rates or any other issue. It's irresponsible, and we should not do that to our men and women in uniform. We should not do that to those in our defense industrial base who as we speak, we're losing jobs because of this, and we're losing capacity in terms of making sure that we have the best for our men and women in uniform. And frankly, we owe them more. We owe them the courage that they show us, that we resolve this right now. And I'm hopeful that on a bipartisan basis, we will get this resolved. It will not become a political football. And I want you to know that I plan to be part of that, to make sure that we resolve this on their behalf. Because if we don't protect our country, we do not fulfill our foremost responsibility under the Constitution to the American people. So I appreciate your having me here today, and you're going to have a great panelist. I see Senator Graham here, who certainly is very interested in resolving this and has been very committed to making sure that our country remains safe. So I'm honored to be here with you today. Thank you. Sure.
Senators agreed to take a question or two, so if I could just ask you to raise your hands. Or if you have no questions, because everything she said is so clear, we'll just take that as a given. Nope.
It's a shy crowd, sure.
Yeah, my name's Russell King. I just have a question about our forest posture in the Arctic. If I look at a chart of the Arctic Ocean with the North Pole in the middle, the Russian Federation has the lion's share of the territory, and I wonder how their forest posture compares to ours in the Arctic, and you might want to discuss icebreakers and also the effect of climate change where we might be constricted and they might not be.
Well, I probably could be a separate whole speech on that issue, but you bring an important issue to bear that this sequestration cuts that come forward is going to impact every aspect of the military because it's an across-the-board cut, and it also impacts the Department of Homeland Security as well. So when you think about things, our capacity, whether it's in the Arctic or any area around the world, it's going to be impacted on it. So, you know, in terms of the national security posture in the Arctic, I will just say this. I don't pretend to be an expert on our national security posture there, but you brought up the topic of Russia, and I can only imagine what the Russians are thinking right now as we prepare to really diminish our strength on the military end. I think it makes us in a much weaker posture when we are addressing issues like Syria and trying to get them to stop providing arms to the Assad regime to kill their own people. And I think that overall it weakens our posture not only with Russia and China, but also in trying to get Iran to give up their acquisition and their attempt to acquire the capability of producing a nuclear weapon. So that's a side issue, but. Thank you. No other questions? I think Senator Graham's going to take all the hard questions, so I'll have him answer them.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you.